Okay, welcome to part 3 of our market failures section. Now we're going to go through a few graphs to see what would externalities look like and how would they be corrected. Graphically, we're going to look at the market for gasoline. So we see a demand curve for gasoline, right? The demand curve shows private value, right? Why do you buy gasoline? So you can go somewhere. The supply curve that firms considering show the private cost. Right, the costs that the sellers incur, whatever the extraction, the transportation of the fuel, the converting it from oil into gasoline, every cost you could imagine, all is factored into that, into the supply curve, how much they'll provide at any given price. Every private cost, I should say. And that gives some equilibrium, right? Some number of gallons, a given price. I don't know what, I have no idea how many gallons per day in the U.S. Maybe this is in the millions for U.S. gallons, or maybe it's for a state, but price of $2.50, quantities 25, right? If there's no externality, this maximizes consumer and producer surplus, as we've learned before, right? This is efficient, it's good, this is a good outcome. People who most want the gasoline get it, the people who can sell it for the lowest price are the ones who get to sell it. It's an efficient outcome, maximizes surplus, but that analysis only applies when there's not an externality. So what about the external costs? Well, say there's $1 per gallon. Value of harm from smog, greenhouse gases, anything else? Well, we have the supply curve that factors in these costs. Like if you had a firm that was considering the social cost, the fact that there's an extra $1 per gallon cost involved in every gallon that they sell, this would be the supply, right? Instead of this lower level, it'd be this higher level. It shifts up by $1, so the supply curve decreases or shifts. I said shifts up, and you shouldn't say shifts up. That's an incorrect way to say it. It shifts to the left by $1, or the supply curve is decreasing. For every given price, they'll be providing less when factoring in the social costs. Well, what would that do with our market, right? Well, we had an original equilibrium, but if the suppliers are considering the cost to society, we see that we really should be at a different outcome, right? We shouldn't be at $2.50 for the price, selling 25 million gallons. Instead, we should be selling 20, right? That's the intersection of the supply curve that factors in the social cost and our demand curve. So, if you sell more than 20, why is this inefficient? Well, what appeared like the demand was greater than the cost, the willingness to provide for, isn't true anymore once you factor in that extra $1 of harm to society, right? These consumers are willing to pay between $2.50 and $3. The actual cost of the product, once you factor in the negative externality, is more than $3, right? For these units, it's inefficient, where people are buying the product and the total cost is more than what they're paying. Well, the way to correct this is actually pretty simple. You impose a $1 per gallon tax on sellers. Once again, you could do it on buyers as well. We've learned before, it doesn't matter who you try to tax, it works out to be the same outcome, same share of distribution, because it's the elasticities of demand and supply. But if you don't put in this tax, you would expect to see 25 gallons sold. That's the market equilibrium. But if you look at the demand curve here, those last 5 gallons or 5 million gallons, if we're thinking of this in millions, the willingness to pay is lower than the total cost once you factor in the cost to the firm, the private firm, and the cost to society. If you put in a tax, the way that you'd think about this in the textbook describes, you want to internalize the externality for the firm, right? The firm initially, they care about their private costs and they want to maximize profits. Well, to internalize the externality, you put a tax equal to whatever the extra social cost was, the additional cost that brought you to the society's cost, and that's just $1 a gallon tax, right? If you put in $1 per gallon tax, it shifts the cost for society, or the social cost. The social cost will be equal to what the firm has to pay now. Right? The firm cares about their supply curve. If you put in a tax of $1, it just shifts up their supply curve. And the firm's supply curve then would be the social cost. Oops, let me move back here. So then the firm would be considering this green supply curve if you put in the tax of $1 per gallon. Right? And this is what we talked about, the efficient way to handle an externality. Figure out the amount of damage from the externality and put in a tax for exactly that amount. And that will get you to the outcome. That will get you to the socially efficient outcome. So internalizing the externality, alter the incentives so people take account of the external effects. So it's the $1 a gallon tax in our case, in the case right here. So if the total costs are considered, you can get to the efficient outcome, the social optimum, right? The original analysis without the tax, there was an efficient outcome, but we weren't hitting it because the firms and the buyers, other people were harmed other than the people who bought it and the firms that were selling. The $1 per gallon tax, now it internalized the externality, you can get to the social optimum. There is some, there is some question, should government be doing this or not? There are some private solutions to externalities, right? Some ways that you could see externalities being handled without the government getting involved. Sometimes it's just people go with some moral code, right? Societal norms, and people will try to adhere to those. Sometimes charities help to correct these. Sometimes it's contracts. And in fact, there's a very specific theorem called the Coase theorem, where if you have private parties that can costlessly bargain over how to allocate resources, externalities can be solved on their own. In order to do this, you need property rights, and the bargaining has to be costless, which usually, in many cases, won't happen. But it is a neat theorem to know that private markets can correct these under the right circumstances. So how does the Coase theorem work? So we've got Dick and Jane. Dick owns a dog named Spot, but Spot barks. Right? This isn't that dissimilar to the idea of somebody playing their loud music at night in the dorm room. Spot's barking disturbs Jane, who's Dick's neighbor. What's the socially efficient outcome? Well, it's making both Dick and Jane as happy as possible. So, Dick values having Spot more than Jane values peace and quiet. The dog should stay. If not, the dog should go. So what's the case here? Let's say that Dick has the property rights here, right? Dick can keep the dog if he wants. And he gets to make the decision. Well, what do we see in this case? The benefit to Dick having Spot is $500. The cost to Jane of Spot's barking is $800. How do you think the market would correct itself? Well, if Jane's cost on this is $800, Dick's benefit of having the dog's only $5, well, they could come to some agreement where Jane will pay Dick between $5 and $800, and the dog is gone, right? Spot goes bye-bye, as we see here. So anywhere between $5 and $800 should work. Both of them would be better off, right? One of the key points here is the property rights need to be clearly defined ahead of time. So say here, the dog owner, Dick, had the property rights to keep the dog. You might understand, well, how would this happen if the barking is damaging Jane? Well, maybe it's Dick is the one who rents this apartment, and Jane is the renter, right? Then the person who owns that really has the property rights to keep the dog. But it doesn't mean they can't reach a private agreement where you'd get rid of the dog anyway, and here both sides are better off. Private outcome, and it's an efficient outcome. So case 2, cost of Jane for Spot's barking is still $800, but the benefit of the dog is $1,000. Spot is staying. Right? There's no transaction they can come to. Jane would be willing to pay up to $800, but Dick views the value of having the dog at $1,000. They're not going to reach any transaction that would be mutually beneficial, so the dog is going to stay. The private outcome is indeed efficient. So what about the third case? Well, here Jane has the legal right to peace and quiet. So now let's say it's Jane's the one who's renting to Dick, and Dick has the dog Spot. So Jane now is the legal owner of the right to peace and quiet. Here, Dick values having Spot at $800. The cost to Jane of Spot's barking is $500. What do you think would happen? Well, here we see the socially efficient outcome is the dog stays. How would they reach this bargain? How would they reach this? If you don't see immediately, why don't you pause it and try to figure out what type of agreement they could come to where Dick could end up keeping the dog. Okay, as you see, Dick pays Jane $600. Jane views $600 as better than the cost of the barking. Dick's happy to have the dog and thinks $600 is better than losing the dog, which would cost him $800. And you do reach the efficient outcome. Right, this is a good example of the Coase theorem. You could bargain, we kind of assume it's costless bargain in this case, but it achieves the efficient outcome regardless of the initial distribution of rights. And the good example of this, there was an externality here, but do you really want the government to deal with this externality? People on their own could figure out a way to have this externality dealt with, and that can happen in some cases. So that was the contribution of Coase. Coase theorem was indeed named after him. So this is the last on our externality section. The one caution and the caveat on the externalities, it's really not in the textbook, but there's a section in economics, there's kind of a idea called public choice theory, and it deals with the fact that government's not always efficient, right? I mean, we know this, and we're going to, in the section where we talk about markets versus command economies, we talk about the fact that, right, governments don't have a profit motive. Because of that, they're not going to be as efficient as the private market. What we just looked at with the externality analysis and putting in the tax, it assumes an efficient government. If your government's going to be inefficient, the threshold for when they should get involved is going to be higher than just any externality, right? Because the government efficiencies will exist when the government gets involved, there really needs to be a pretty severe externality, because the government can be costly, right? Government agencies don't go away well. Governments can abuse their power more easily. Government officials don't have a profit motive. It's not market-based. It's tough for them to be anywhere close to efficient as the private market. You're paying government officials to administrate that, which is, of course, a cost to society. So there are all sorts of reasons not to have the government get involved here. As you move along in economics, you could do much more complicated analysis to see when is it involved. But know that there are government costs. There are times when maybe there's a small externality and the government really should just not get involved because it's not efficient. More advanced analysis could try to tease out the exact idea of when should the government involve versus not get involved. It's a little bit beyond the idea for the course. The biggest things that I want you to know is that private market's not always going to be the efficient outcome when you have an externality. And if the government can be moderately efficient or the externality is really large, government action can make it better some of the time, although there are times when private bargaining can get you to the efficient solution.